You also wrote a blog post recently giving a shout out to the new book, The Blocksize Wars. What is a block size? What are the block size wars? Its history, its importance, its philosophical foundations.
Yeah, I mean, Bitcoin at this point, we have our own civil wars. If you're wondering about how politically intense it gets,
it's currently not hot; it's cold.
Oh yeah, we're in a détente right now.
There's no tanks or missiles, at least not yet. Hopefully,
it can get a little violent, I guess. I think one of the Bitcoin core developers or one of the participants in the war got swatted at one point.
What swatted means?
When someone does a fake phone call saying that you're holding someone hostage at your house and the SWAT team goes. It's pretty scary.
Wow.
Internet warfare tactic. Yeah. But the block size war, I would say, effectively ended. Although we're definitely going to have more civil wars in Bitcoin for sure. But basically the core argument was a technical one on its surface, but a very deep political one at its core. The technical question is how many megabytes should be in each successive block. So Satoshi basically installed a limit of 1 megabyte per block.
So we should backtrack. There was no limit in the beginning. And it seems like Satoshi, what is this, 2000? The war started in what, 2017 or something like that? I don't know when the
15 was when the
battle cries began.
What was the first battle in the Civil War? I'm trying to remember.
But sort of Satoshi, I don't know if you can comment on it. Like, why did Satoshi set the limit to 1 megabyte all of a sudden, almost secretively? And in the beginning, there was no limit whatsoever.
Yeah, I mean, we can get into, and people have spent thousands of hours poring over Satoshi's writings to find, which side Satoshi was on. And you can find, like any textual exegesis, you can find evidence for either side, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, effectively, when Bitcoin was launched, there was a block size because if you made a block over a certain size with the first edition of the code, it would have crashed nodes. But then, in 2010, Satoshi added the 1 megabyte limit in a covert way with no comments or anything. And that stuck, basically. And then Bitcoin blocks filled up, and people that had been socialized into this vision of Bitcoin as an effectively free transactional network were like, why pay a transaction fee if you're not at congestion? If the block isn't full, the miner will mine your transaction for free, right? People that had been brought up in that status quo from 2009 to kind of 2015, they noticed the blocks started to fill up, and they're like, okay, well, let's just remove this arbitrary limit, right? What could possibly be the harm?
Right.
And then a whole other faction said, no, you need to cap the data throughput of the system, because if you increase it, it's going to be highly exclusionary, and ultimately regular folks are not going to be able to run a full node.
So there's a fixed number, there's a fixed frequency of blocks. And so if you want to increase the number of transactions per second, you want to increase the size of the block. So huge blocks allow you to shove in a lot of transactions.
Right.
Small blocks don't. So that's what you mean, like constraining the system. So what's the benefit of a small block size where transactions, when you can squeeze in only a small number of transactions? And what's the benefit of a huge block size where you can squeeze in a lot of transactions?
Well, it really comes down to the way that you think about the system. So a lot of people wanted Bitcoin to be Visa scale. So to have blocks sufficiently large that you could accommodate a Visa level scale of transactions. So,
which is many orders of magnitude more transactions.
That's right. I mean, preposterously larger in terms of data throughput than, Bitcoin offers up, or at least it used to, 144 megabytes of space per day, and your average transaction's 350 bytes. So, you could, at a push, do 400,000 or 500,000 transactions a day, which is not many. So if you wanted to get to Visa scale, you'd have to increase blocks obnoxiously large. The small blockers claimed that this would overwhelm the ability of any regular person to ingest that data and stay current at the state of the ledger, to replay all those transactions to ensure that the protocol rules were valid. So basically, the small blocker contention is that you eliminate the trustlessness of the system by pushing a ton of data through the system, because only one or two industrial heavy duty nodes would ever be able to run the protocol at that point.
So, by the way, in the Civil War, the two sides, as you're calling them, the small blocker and the big blocker sides.
Yeah.
And so that takes us back to the thing that you mentioned, that a regular computer could be a node, and with big blocks, that's no longer going to be the case. So just the number of transactions is going to blow up the size of the blockchain that every full node has to store. And so then, as opposed to a regular mom and pop type of node, you're going to have data centers. So they're going to have to be owned by large organizations. There's going to have to be very few of them. And that's how you centralize the control over this whole operation. So the big blocker, yes, it allows you to be Visa and do a huge number of transactions, but it becomes centralized. And then the small blocker is, you cannot actually do kind of merchant style transactions, but you get the decentralized benefit.
Well, I don't even think the big block approach would allow you to be Visa, frankly, because there's effectively one node in the Visa network, right? So you don't really need to maintain this peer-to-peer architecture at all. And the amount of data you'd have to push through the network to reach Visa scale is a really preposterous amount. I mean, and we have now evidence for what happens when you try and scale up as a blockchain and do 10 million transactions a day, which is still not Visa scale, right? You know, I've seen what it's like to operate those nodes, and it's not pretty. So there are totally genuine computer science physical limits, because it's a broadcast network. Everyone has to be aware of every transaction, and that model, which gives you the trustlessness, the nice guarantees where everyone's an equal peer on the network, everyone has audited the full history of the transactions, that model falls apart under stress. So the small blocker vision is that ultimately you would scale in a layered approach, with the base layer transactions being settlement style transactions, and payments happening at the other layers, basically.
Is that universally agreed upon, or like to a large degree agreed upon, that the small blockers have won in this debate?
Well,
where would you put the current state of affairs?
there was a wave of competing Bitcoin implementations starting in 2015 with Bitcoin XT. Actually, Gavin Andresen, who was the guy that Satoshi handed the reins to when Satoshi left, Gavin supported this large block proposal. And so that didn't achieve consensus. And then there was Bitcoin Unlimited. And then later on, there was a genuine hard fork where the small blockers couldn't, or the large blockers couldn't push through their proposals on Bitcoin itself. So they just created a competing version of Bitcoin,
So by the way, so maybe you can comment on, but sort of hard fork versus a soft fork. A hard fork is when it's no longer compatible. What's the right way to put it? They can't operate on the same blockchain, with the same protocol.
Yeah, so there's a few ways to define them, and it gets controversial as well. But one way to define it as a hard fork is a expansion of protocol rules, and a soft fork is a shrinking of protocol rules.
That's an interesting way to define it.
It's not very intuitive, so I don't like that way. Another way is that a hard fork is backwards incompatible, whereas soft fork is, in theory, backwards compatible. So in August 2017, basically the large blockers had enough, and they said, we're going to hard fork Bitcoin. We're going to create a clone, an alternative version of Bitcoin, which has a shared history as Bitcoin itself, but you completely fork it and you create a new future. And but everybody that had a balance on Bitcoin at the time also had a balance on the alternative coin, Bitcoin Cash. And so that was really,
That's what it's called. Bitcoin Cash is the hard fork.
that was one of them. There were more, actually. I mean, there
What
are
the
a
heck is
number.
Bitcoin Satoshi's Vision BSV, Bitcoin SV? So this is all talking about increasing the limit of the block size more and more and more.
Yeah, that was one of the changes they wanted to push through. But BSV was a fork of Bitcoin Cash. So it's kind
Hard
of
fork
like,
of Bitcoin Cash.
yeah. So now there's multiple big blocker blockchains floating around. It's like,
What are your thoughts about them?
well,
Because they're pretty popular. Sorry to interrupt.
are they popular? I mean, if you look at the metrics, they're not, and
Oh,
they don't trade. I think each trade below 1% of the value of Bitcoin
I
itself.
see. So measuring popularity is like how much they actually, value or
Value.
frequency of trade.
Oh no, I mean, they do like a fair number of transactions, but there's no way to know that that is genuine or just contrived. So,
Got it.
ultimately the true measure, I think, in my mind, is just where the market prices these protocols relative to Bitcoin, because that's like a prediction market. If Bitcoin Cash was being priced at 50% of Bitcoin, you could say the market has given it a 50% chance of unseating Bitcoin, right? But both Bitcoin Cash and Bitcoin SV, which was a hard fork from Bitcoin Cash itself,
Mhm.
are I believe at this point, well below 1% of the value of Bitcoin.
And in like the ranking of different cryptocurrencies, what is it? Bitcoin, Ethereum? Is Ethereum in value
Yeah, it's number
second?
2.
And then
Yeah.
Bitcoin Cash is somewhere it's in the top 5, right? But it's just a fast drop off.
I haven't checked lately, but I think it's reached kind of morbidity. It doesn't really have much traction. The blocks aren't full, so the whole value proposition was, we will get all this merchant adoption if we increase the block size. That just didn't materialize. In my view, they had a flawed vision of how adoption works and what blockchain should optimize for. Maybe you get a Bitcoin Cash supporter on the show. They'll give you a different answer. But yeah, full disclosure, I have my sympathies, and I think the small blockers won that skirmish for sure.
So at this time, there's no merchant adoption and so on. So it's kind of its vision, the whole reason for existence, at least for now, hasn't materialized. And so that's a indication as possible that, well, it's a sign that perhaps that's the wrong way to accomplish the scalability.